Concentration, all of us in this room can say, is essential. It's essential in so many different ways. For instance, it enables us to, of course, make those step-by-step connections and discoveries that are involved in developing and testing concepts. Of course, a steady, concentrated focus is vital for making sense of things, but also for thinking innovatively, and also, of course, connecting to our realms of imagination. It also enables us to create a space for the contemplative ways of being, or what Thomas Merton would call recollection. So for Merton, recollection was not just a rigid mental effort, but was connected to a quiet, receptive attention anchored in the present moment and God's presence. He taught that true contemplation requires letting go of the false ego and conventional ideas to embrace inner stillness, allowing for a deeper awareness of the sacredness of life. Such concentration, especially recollection, enables space for inspiration and genuinely the new flashes, you could say flashes, we have flashes of insight and understanding that reach beyond the subject and object duality and permit communion with the known and the unknown. Now, it is interesting to note that scientific critiques of the digital age say it's cultivating more and more and more extreme individualism and compartmentalized thinking, rather than systems thinking and understanding that we are part of an ecological whole, rather than just consumers who don't even need to think about natural contexts while making impulse buys on the online Amazon. Such ecological thinkers like Friedrich Capra or the beloved German Peter Wohlenmann want us to remember connections and interconnectedness and how we relate to the real world Amazon and to all the sources and resources that those sources come from that are mobilized by our social and economic systems. So to the mystics, from Hildegard von Bingen and Meister Eckhart here in Germany, to the Sufi Muslims like Ibn al-Arabi and Rabi al-Adawiya, the contemplative life was always connected to that larger world and cosmos, each developing their own understanding of spiritual cosmology and daily practices on how, of course, to live that cosmology. Spiritual cosmology is compatible with the more holistic insights of systems thinking, but of course goes further. It is a holistic thinking and being in its most, you could say, expansive sense. For instance, one could say that the cosmicized understanding of the mystics can be related to systems thinking by trying to see things whole and interconnected, but it requires, of course, consciousness, withness, with knowing, engagement, relational. And of course, that relation is connected to symbolism and the interpretation of it, the recognition of it and the many, 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 many layers of reality. And of course, our potential insights into it. If there is something like a perennial philosophy, a core truth shared by the world's great wisdom traditions, ancient and ever present, what Renaissance philosophers call the prisca theologica, then it might be most visibly found in the concepts of the absolute. And of course, last night, some of our beloved speakers evoked, of course, this notion of the absolute. So I just want to say real briefly, whether Chinese, Indian, Greek, Hebrew, Arabic, you name it, it can go on. The literatures arising out of the lives of the prophets and the saints and the sages and this beyond demonstrate a remarkable degree of unanimity in suggesting that the absolute is in essence beyond concept, form, limitation, category, understanding, totally ineffable. And yet, out of this absolute unknown, this impenetrable, magisterial mystery, arises everything known and encountered. We find agreement that there is some kind of gradation of being from the unknown essence to subtle and then more solid, sensible manifestations. This is the age-old mystery of the one and the many. All traditions have been bewildered by this mystery. And we're more narrowly analytical, instrumental, literal, linear, rational, deductive modes of thinking are useful. Very. Hello. Couldn't have said that sentence without it. They're useful for satisfying human needs and for situations in which we must make either or decisions or choices and optimize our behavior. The cosmological modes of consciousness engaged by mystics place us in a universe of complementary rather than oppositional principles, in which we must be willing to suspend what we think we know to experience something more, to be receptive to a greater reality. And from my perspective, our world has been suffering from imbalances rooted in inadequate attention to the holistic, mystical epistemologies and over-reliance on more fragmented dualistic ways of knowing, in which one maximizes aspirations for control and certainty while allowing little space for contemplation of the unknown and for devoting time and attention to more richly symbolic maps. Yeah. What my beloved professor who I came from, Abdulaziz Said, would say, makes it harder for each of us to surrender to the grace of the moment. One aspect of this idea of complementarity and the critique of how we're not seeing complementarity as much as we're seeing oppositional forces in the world is, of course, connection to gender and the balancing of the masculine and the feminine. Yeah. From a mystic standpoint, masculine and feminine principles relate to complementarities, and that they are really truly cosmic, basically different aspects of the divine suffuse all creation. And you could say it's like in a manner akin to yin and yang. In Sufism, I'm getting there. In Sufism, which has been described, of course, as the mystical dimension of Islam, such metaphysics of the masculine and feminine are connected to different qualities, characteristics, attributes, of course, of Allah, the one God. Now, there are many Muslim mystics whose thought explores the spiritual cosmological ways of knowing and being. For today, I would like to just share briefly some thoughts by the beloved Muhyiddin ibn al-Arabi, who lived from 1165 to 1240 CE. You know, Ibn al-Arabi was both a great synthesizer and, to use a word that evokes today's multiverse of the internet, he, of course, was a great influencer, larger than life. Uh, he was born in the 12th century Andalusia, which was a great intersection among medieval, Islamic, Christian, Jewish cultures. He was known for traveling extensively throughout North Africa, the Middle East, from southern Spain to the Fertile Crescent, to the Arabian Peninsula, Anatolia, eventually settling and died in Damascus, Syria, the oldest inhabited city of the world. We know that at each way station of Ibn al-Arabi's journey, he engaged new communities of learning, courted patrons, and shared his unique articulation of Sufi philosophy, building a network of appreciative students and readers that eventually extended from Eastern Atlantic to the Pacific Rim, from Central Asia to the Sahel of Africa. That's an influencer if I've ever heard it. As many scholars state, no Sufi thinker was more influential and had a greater impact on the development of mystical philosophy in the Islamic contexts. He has many titles, Sheikh al-Akbar, but my favorite is Ibn Platun, the son of Plato. So let me share a little bit. Throughout his writings, Ibn al-Arabi intentionally evokes the experiences of the one and the many, of unity and diversity. One could say he even is encouraging us to embrace the everyday unity in diversity. This principle of unity is known, of course, in Arabic as tawheed, which is a foundational, if not essential, Islamic philosophical and theological concept. You know, Tawheed can be defined many ways. It can be defined as the unity of God, the unity of humanity, the unity of truth itself, the universe, you name it. It is all oneness. It is the one that transcends all duality and plurality, and yet at the same time manifests all of the diversity and multiplicity. One could say that Tawheed ultimately allows for the reconciliation within multiplicity at cosmic and microcosmic levels, and affirms that the manyness of reality is itself a pattern of connectedness. In other words, multiplicity has to be seen within, especially the context of divine oneness that both transcends and also includes all created things. So this is a very universalistic concept that commands that the material and the spiritual are one. And there's lots of quotes, but here's just one quote from Ibn al-Arabi's Kitab al-Alif, translated into English. That which is worshipped by every tongue in all states and at all times is the one. Every worshipper of whatever kind is the one. Thus, there is nothing but the one, and there is no existence for other than the one. There is no such thing as increase when the one manifests in two intelligible degrees. It is called two, like this. When it manifests in 3 degrees, it is like this, 3. This is oneness of God, the real. By the oneness of the real, we are manifest. If he were not, we would not be. But our existence does not necessitate that he, glory to him, is not. End quote. I'd just like to share real quick. I hope that's okay for a minute. I'm a mom, and I don't know how many of you are parents, but if you have beloved children, or if you have beloved nieces or nephews, or if you've ever been connected to children, ah, magical, awe, wonder. There's so much that we learn. It's unbelievable. And I remember when the beloved Mikhail, who's with us now, when he was just learning how to, of course, talk and wake up very early at 5 a.m., doesn't do that anymore. And get up and we're waking up. And I'm like, and I remember he was just learning, how to talk. And one morning, he just was like, one, 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 boom. And I was like waking up and I'm like, yes, one. you know? And then, of course, as a good mother, I knew I had to teach him 1, 2, 3, but I didn't want him to lose the one, one, one. And so we would have this game. And so for the next 6 months or so, we would have this game. And I would go like this to him at the very beginning of the morning. I'd go like this. And sometimes he would be one, one, one. And then as he's learning the numbers, 1, 2, 3. But he would be like, sometimes one, one, one. And you're trying. And then, as he's learning, and we have this game, one day, woke up at 5 a.m. and he said something different, but was also true. What do you think he said? None. And I'm like, that's also true. Yeah. Mikhail. I remember also when he was very young, he only wanted to sleep in our heart room. We have a room dedicated for the contemplative. And in the heart room, we have in a corner the 99 names of Allah, Asma Allah al-Husna, as they're known in Arabic. And I remember Mikhail pointing to them saying, angels, angels, 99 names. And that's where I'm going next. Yeah, please know, in general, Muslims tend to believe that God's essence is beyond human understanding. But what can be known is represented through the names, revealed, of course, in the Quran, the holy book for Muslims, which, of course, try to communicate something of God's qualities in human language. And the Quran itself affirms that the most beautiful names belong to God and that humans are beckoned to call upon them. And notably, even though God is transcendent beyond human abilities of comprehension, the names are doorways or bridges from known to the unknown. And it is ironic, you could say, that they are language whose meaning points beyond language. Okay? Additionally, the names of God are a bridge from the divine essence to the manifest cosmos and the bridge back to the essence. So for Ibn al-Arabi, the nature of the human being is one who has, by nature, the potential to know and thereby reflect into the world all of the God's names. And there's a beautiful quote by Ibn al-Arabi, quote, "We are the locus wherein the divine names are disclosed." Their essence is witnessed only within us because of the divine form in which he created us. And this is another quote by Ibn al-Arabi. So our kingdom, our mulk, is all of the divine names. Each of us has a kingdom with the divine names. There is no divine name of which we do not possess a portion. God says, my earth and my heaven embrace me not, but the heart of my believing servant does embrace me. It is as if he is saying, all my names become manifest only within the human configuration. And so, of course, a lot of scholars in Ibn Arabi say that he's pointing to the potentiality for completion and perfection that sets the human beings apart from other creation. And that's why there's this whole concept of vicegerent of God, the caretaker, the caregiver of all God's creation, the Khalifa. So, how am I doing on time? Am I okay? Do I have about 10 more minutes? Is it okay?
We lost track.
Okay. Oh, I'll try to get going. So in the Sufi tradition or mystical understanding of Islam, this cultivating of oneself, the character traits of the one, is known as takhallaq akhlaq Allah. And this process can be defined as a qualifying of oneself with the qualities of God. Basically, the names are a method, you could say, of remembering God, becoming a member again in, with, from, to God. And this remembrance, this constant remembrance, evokes, of course, a state of mind of tawheed in, of course, the heart and beyond. Unity is never absence from us. So with spiritual practice, the individual continually aspires to enter deeply into a divine quality by meditating, of course, on it and internalizing it and ultimately living. So for Ibn al-Arabi, the purpose of human life in general and the spiritual path in particular is actualizing and witnessing the names of God in a comprehensive manner. And he stated, quote, becoming characterized by the character traits of God, that is Islamic spirituality, end quote. And there are many, many names. I said 99. I'm not going to go through all of them, but of course I put some on the slides. Ya Rahman, the compassionate. My favorite, Ya Wadud, the loving, the origin of all love. Ya Salam, peace. There are many, 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 many names. And these names, of course, are categorized. And this is where you get the gendering of Sufism, the categorization of the feminine and the masculine. And of course, from a Sufi Muslim perspective, these qualities are complementarity. They're complementary of one another. They're not opposites of one another. And so the masculine qualities are known as the Jalali qualities of the one, the majestic, you could say, but also, of course, connected to the transcendent, the inaccessible, the incomprehensible, that which is beyond qualities of God. Whereas the feminine qualities are known as the Jamaliya qualities and connected to names like the gentle, the light, love, generous, forgiving, merciful. In a beautiful book called The Tao of Islam, a source book on gender relationship in Islamic thought, Sachiko Murada, dear colleague of mine, noticed a very remarkable difference in emphasis between the Orthodox jurisprudent and the Sufi Muslim understanding of these qualities of Jalal and Jamal. And I'm just going to read a quote from her. Quote, experts in jurisprudence, especially those Muslim authorities who defend the outward and legalistic teachings of Islam, lay stress upon God's incomparability. They insist that he is wrathful and warn constantly about hell and divine punishment. He is distant, dominating, and powerful ruler whose commands must be obeyed. His attributes are those of a strict and authoritarian father. In contrast, those authorities who are more concerned with Islam's spiritual dimensions constantly remind the community of the prophetic sayings, God's mercy is greater than his wrath. They maintain that mercy, love, gentleness are the overriding reality of existence, and that these will win out in the end. God is not a primarily stern and forbidding father, but also a warm and loving mother. And to quote by Sachiko. So even though there are many different Sufi schools of thought, you could say that this concentration on the Jamal relationships in, of course, balance with the Jalal is key. And please know that Sufi Muslims do not and are very, very careful and not not emphasizing, you could say, or denying God's incomparability. No, it's the balancing of the two. Ibn al-Arabi actually is known for saying that in his critique of the Jalal only perception, quote, Islamic theology stresses God's incomparability so much that it negates the possibility of love between humans and God, end quote. So ontologically, for Ibn al-Arabi, incomparability without gentleness and nearness without inaccessibility are incomplete perspectives. You have to see them as one. So to express a balance of complementary attributes, Ibn al-Arabi would say that whenever he felt a spiritual expansion, a manifestation of the Jamal, the feminine, attributes that give you that nearness of God, he would at the same time feel the Jalali attributes of the inaccessible. It's beautiful. So to Ibn al-Arabi, a mindful dialogue, which is what we're all here for, consists of both Jamal and Jalal qualities, realities. One is not right with or wrong without the other. And the seeming contradictions and oppositions reflect deeper principles and pathways to harmony. Yeah. And from my perspective, I thought it would be nice to have this beautiful image of the world from space, the Earth from space, or from the moon's orbit to celebrate what just happened with Artemis 2. And this beautiful image is a compelling metaphor, I thought. Really helps us to understand and how to engage mindful dialogue in order to be informed by a more contemplative awareness. And why? Well, it is very interesting when you're at the ground level of the earth, how all these lines and borders, right, sort of have huge influence on our imagination and our consciousness. But wow, from the heights, yeah, moves beyond. What a beautiful image for a mindful dialogos. So I'm just going to end in my conclusion by evoking a name of the beloved, and that is Salam. Yes, Salam, which is, of course, the origin of all peace. And here are some thoughts from a dear, beautiful, beloved professor of mine. And I would not be here, Dominique, if it wasn't for Abdulaziz Said. So he is right here with me. And here are some of his words for you, Dominique, because I truly believe this. You live these words. From Abdulaziz, quote, when peace emanates from us, peace returns to us. We become peaceful, a source and a mirror of peace. Our thoughts, words, and deeds are in harmony. Peace becomes a state of consciousness, encompassing our total experience. It does not oppose one state of consciousness. It is in itself whole. It includes feeling, reason, sensing, and intuition. When we experience peace, we are able to go beyond self. We feel less self-absorbed and less self-important. We become more individually authentic and simultaneously able to recognize and appreciate the genuine uniqueness of others. We become free to feel. We become free to feel anger, hurt, pain, suffering, healing, loving. We become free to think with reason, making tight sequential connections, to think with wonder, making connections of a random kind, to think with images, making connections of a visual kind. We see the truth of reason, the truth of wonder, the truth of images. We see the little pieces of truth. Of course, we see the whole truth. The whole, then, is reflected in its diverse parts, and from its parts, the information of the whole can be reconstructed. The total is greater than the parts, but only when we take the parts into account. So when we empathize with each other, we discover that human life or the human predicament is so similar in its deeper significance and issues, whatever our society, religion, culture, or gender. When we begin to empathize, we also start to learn the patterns of human connection and the art of peacemaking. And we begin to create peace. We become like Dominique. I added that.
Okay, thank you, Meena. I think that we'll maybe leave all questions for the end of the session because maybe there are some interconnected questions after all. Okay, now I will introduce, but I will also read a paper. Okay. The next speaker is Professor Dr. Luce Lopez-Baralt from Puerto Rico. She is Distinguished Professor, Insignis Professor, and Emeritus Professor of Spanish and Comparative Literatures at the University of Puerto Rico. She is author of 30 books on comparative Spanish and Arabic literatures and mysticism, Aljamiado, Moorish, and Latin American literatures. And, well, unfortunately, Luce cannot join us today here in person, but she has sent her paper and I will read it. I'll have the honor of reading Luce Lopez-Baralt's paper. So the title of the paper is Borges in Dialogue with Islamic Mysticism. Okay, so I'm going to read Luce's paper. Okay, so this is Borges in Dialogue with Islamic Mysticism. Jorge Luis Borges engages Islamic culture not as an exotic curiosity, but as a vital component of his broader literary and spiritual inquiry. His distinctive form of Orientalism must be understood within the context of his expansive intellectual openness towards all cultures. Borges enters into sustained dialogue with a wide range of traditions, including the Bible, Kabbalah, Christian heterodoxy or heresiarchs, Buddhism, agnosticism, and centrally Islam. His work anticipates later developments in comparative religion and intercultural thought, preceding both Edward Said's critique of Orientalism and the interreligious explorations of figures such as Thomas Merton, Ernesto Cardenal, Dag Hammarskjöld, and Hugo Mujica. The Argentinian writer addresses his perplexity about the East with a quotation from Juvenal. All that seems mysterious and remote is located precisely ultra auroram et gangem, beyond the dawn and the Ganges. That is to say, in the East. In those 4 words, says Borges, is for us the Orient. En estas 4 palabras está el Oriente para nosotros. Although the East is inscrutable, the Argentine maestro, like Kipling, finds it also irresistible. I quote, "Once you have heard the call of the East, you will never hear anything else." I'll also read the quotation in the original Spanish because the words sound beautiful. Si has oído el llamado del Oriente, ya no oirás otra cosa. Borges mastered with uncanny ease the belles lettres of both the West and East, and moreover set them, like shifting mirrors, into an unexpected literary dialogue. Borges thus renews the cultural legacy of the West when he appropriates foreign literary canons and brings them into coexistence with his own literary tradition. Borges had such a penchant for comparative mystical symbolism because, in spite of his proclaimed agnosticism and nonchalant attitude, he was a mystic himself. He confessed to Willis Barnstone in an interview in 1982 that he had twice experienced the mystical experiences so common to his works. I quote, "In my life, I had 2 mystical experiences, and I can't tell them because what happened is not to be put into words, since words, after all, stand for a shared experience. And if you have not had the experience, then you can share it, as if we were to talk about the taste of coffee and have never tried coffee." I was overwhelmed, taken aback. I had the feeling of living not in time, but outside time. I don't know how long that feeling lasted, since I was outside time. It may have been a minute or so, it may have been longer. But I know I had that feeling in Buenos Aires twice in my life. Once I had it on the south side, near the railroad station Constitución. Somehow, the feeling came over me that I was living beyond time, and I did my best to capture it, but it came and went. I wrote poems about it, but they are normal poems and do not tell the experience. I cannot tell it to you since I cannot retell it to myself, but I had that experience and I had it twice over, and maybe it will be granted to me to have it once more before I die. End of quote. Borges also confessed this same moving personal experience to me, that is to Luce, on 4 different occasions. He spoke with the sincere surprise of someone who is speaking of circumstances he has not fully understood, but nevertheless, which he respects, with an intuitive sense of veneration. He looked surprised and vulnerable when he spoke. Somehow, his spiritual confession rang true. Borges gave me much more details about his satori or enlightenment than he had given Barnstone. The first time we spoke was in 1983 in Dickinson College, Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And here, this is a parenthesis. I'm very happy to read this because we have many students from my university going to college now. There is an exchange with Dickinson, so this is enlightening. During a congress dedicated to his works, which I attended with my husband and Borges scholar Arturo Echavarria. I had just read Barnston's interview, and having dedicated my life to study comparative mysticism, decided immediately to talk to Borges. To my surprise, he agreed without hesitation, and we were able to speak in private. He confirmed with candor that he had the two experiences during his youth, during a period of deep emotional depression due to disappointment in love. One of these mystical trances happened at the Constitución Bridge of train stations in Buenos Aires. Borges seems to remember this personal incident when he makes his fictional character, Borges, walk along Constitución right after losing Beatriz Viterbo in the short story The Aleph, El Aleph, and Teodolina Villar in the short story El Zahir, the Zahir. It was there in Constitución, he continues to tell me, that he suddenly felt himself out of time and space, living in a level of consciousness stretched to infinity. He advised me to read carefully his poem Matthew 25:30. For all of his writings that deal with eternity and the mystical experience, he felt it was the one that best conveyed what he really experienced and the anguish he felt at never being able to put it into words. In the poem, Borges describes being overwhelmed in the Constitución Bridge by una voz infinita, an infinite voice, that bestowed on him absolute knowledge of the universe. For years, he tried to convey the experience in words, only to realize that todavía no has escrito el poema. You have yet to write the poem. The horrible punishment given in Matthew 25:30 to the serf that buried the coin the master gave him was to be cast in the dark, amid tears and grinding of teeth. Borges seems to imply that he was given the experience of the absolute, but he buried it in language, thereby falsifying it. The harsh punishment he symbolically gives himself seems to betray his frustration as a writer at never being able to make justice to his mystical experience. As we shall soon see, he tries to avoid in the Zahir this falsification of the unending transcendental experience. In our conversation, Borges insisted that it was useless to try to speak of the experience, for it was not verbal, but strictly beyond the grasp of language. I was able to understand in a new, personal way why the Aleph he symbolically saw in the basement was a false Aleph, for the narrator of the story translated it into language, while the Aleph hidden in the column of the Cairo Mosque was the true one, for it was only heard as a murmur and was never falsified by the human word. The story, the writing of the god, also became clear. The imprisoned Sinakan suddenly receives a revelation and understands the god's writing in the marking of the tiger, but knows that the immense secret cannot be shared, so he silences it. I also understood why the other side of the coin of the Zahir must remain untouched, as I will explain later. Borges thus seemed to be a knowledgeable mystic, as respectful with the ineffable as St. John of the Cross, Meister Eckhart, or Thomas Merton. I asked Borges again about his ecstatic experiences during the question and answer period of the Congress, to see if he would deny in public what he had told me in private. The comments were exactly the same. We met again in 1983 at the University of Chicago during another seminar, and I talked to Borges once again about his mystical experiences. His words were unequivocal. He had had two undescribable experiences he could never forget. When I asked him to explain in public his two experiences in detail, this time he answered back. I quote, "You write about St. John of the Cross, and you know that I simply cannot reply. These experiences cannot be shared." End of quote. Later on, I was to learn from Maria Kodama that Borges had also shared his mystical experiences with her, trying to come to terms with them. He even planned to go back to a Zen monastery he had visited before in Kyoto, this time for a whole year, to explore his satori or mystical experience using the method of the koan, but he fell ill with cancer and died before he could travel to Japan. It stands out that Borges felt at ease dealing with his own spirituality within the framework of Oriental spirituality. The Islamic literary canon is one of the most important in Borges' rewriting of Western belles lettres. He employs traditional Islamic motifs to forge masterpieces like, and now I'll quote titles of his short stories, The Sahir, In Search of Averroes, Ibn Akam al-Bukhari Murdered in His Labyrinth, Hakim, the Masked Dyer of Merv, The Approach to Al-Mutasim, The Mirror of Ink, The Simurgh and the Eagle, Ariosto and the Arabs, The Unending Rose, Metaphors of the 1001 Nights, among others. In his delicate ode Al Ruiseñor, to the nightingale, Borges evokes the two different cultural traditions that celebrate the nightingale. The nightingale sung by Virgil and by the Persians, Ruiseñor de Virgilio y de los persas. For he knows perfectly well that in Sufism, the famous bird is associated with joyous mystical experience rather than with the Virgilian Miserabile Carmen or melancholic song. The erudite Argentinian writer, setting the mystical bol exalted by Rumi and Attar against Ovid's, Heine's, and Keats' Philomela, succeeds again in contrasting and perhaps merging the Western and Islamic literary canons. The rose, so charged with symbolism and so ubiquitous in mythology, is also ambiguous for Borges, for the flower, like the nightingale, belongs to two very different literary traditions, European and Islamic. When Borges simultaneously addresses the rose sung by the Persians and by Ariosto, La Rosa de los Persas y de Ariosto, in The Rose, he expects his readers to be conversant not only with the Italian Renaissance poet, but again with Sufi poets like Rumi and Attar, who equate the rose with the presence of the living, ineffable God. This is in Fervor de Buenos Aires. Likewise, he expects his readers to deconstruct his delicate poem, The Unending Rose, from La Rosa Profunda, one of his finest pieces incorporating Islamic literary motifs, against the same backdrop of the Islamic imagery of the Sufi's unending rose of the infinite deity. Many critics seem baffled by Borges' Islamic symbols and literary motifs. It must be said that Borges, who often quotes false sources, has done everything in his power to conceal his real grasp of Islamic culture. He insisted that the Sahir, for example, was a perfectly ordinary object, algo muy común, albeit inolvidable, unforgettable, unvergesslich, inoubliable. How much did Borges really know about Arabic literature, whose rich tradition he made the epicenter of many of his finest literary texts? More than he openly admitted, and certainly much more than his critics have so far presumed. Borges read deeply in Islamic literature, theology, and mysticism. So deeply that we are still in the process of understanding the real implications of his artistic experiment. Arabic culture was a lifelong passion for Borges. He gave lectures on Sufism in Buenos Aires as a young man, and he even ventured to learn the rudiments of the Arabic language. Trying to master the Arabic language meant so much to Borges that he gave it another try before he died in Geneva. Héctor D'Amico gives a detailed account of the Arabic classes that an Egyptian professor gave Borges on his deathbed. Maria Kodama herself told me how she drew the letters on Borges' palm, for he could no longer see them. Each time I met Borges, he asked me to pronounce in Arabic the original title of his beloved 1001 Nights, Alf Laila wa Laila, and he discussed with me the merits of the several translations of it he knew so well. I will never forget his delighted expression when he heard in awe the sound of the language. Okay, now I'll read a section of the paper which is entitled The Sahir. I will now take a close look at the Sahir, Borges' most enigmatic and demanding Oriental story, so we can see how truly knowledgeable the maestro was of Islamic religious motifs and how well he understood the mystical experience itself. Without a fundamental knowledge of Sufism, the reader simply cannot decipher the basics of the story. It has been much misunderstood. Erika Spivakovsky, in 1968, asserts that, I quote, contrary to other Arab-inspired stories, the Sahir is invented throughout, even the sources, end of quote. While Floyd Merrill, in 1991, is equally disappointed with the enigmatic coin, quote, the Sahir is ultimately a helpless symbol, end of quote. I beg to differ. In his short story, Borges tries to convey the fact that the mystical experience is ineffable, for it is experienced outside time, space, language, and outside the rational mind. The extremely complex Sahir makes a strong case for the insufficiency of language to convey in words the mystical trance. In Arabic, the word Sahir, from the triliteral root ZHR, means visible or manifest. The fictionalized Borges, who is the narrator and protagonist of the story, describes the Sahir, which is for him an Argentine coin worth 20 cents. I quote, a razor or letter opener had scratched the letters NT and the number 2 on the face of the coin, end of quote. Yet the narrator tells us nothing about its reverse. That other side remains unseen and unspoken. Borges suggests that language comes to a halt respectfully vis-a-vis the reverse side of the coin. NT stands for the Latin noli tangere, do not touch. The narrator gives another strange clue. In other times, the Sahir has been many other things. In Gujarat, it was a tiger. In Java, a blind man in the Surakarta mosque. In Persia, an astrolabe. In the synagogue of Córdoba, a vein in the marble. Here, the arcane story merges with a more prosaic one. El Sahir is a binary narration, like the dual 20 cents, 20 centavos coin. The night before the Sahir came into the possession of the narrator, he had attended the wake for Teodelina Villar, whom he had loved when he was 20. Again, the monetary value of the coin. She had been a model whose photographs or attributes had littered the pages of worldly magazines, thus becoming common currency for all those who superficially possessed her in the commercial advertisements. But her inner being would forever escape her admirers, as her name suggests. Theodolina points, in fact, to the Sahir. Theo refers to God, and Delina, from the Greek delo, means to clarify, to make visible or manifest. Thus, the visible or manifest God. As we shall see later, her occult reverse is also like the unreachable other side of the Sahir. Adelo, the occult and inscrutable, gives way in Spanish to a common name, Adela, which would be the secret and mystical name of Borges' beloved. Yet, he never mentions the secret reverse name of Theodelina, a poor cause. He will keep to himself forever what lies on the other side of the coin, what lies beyond language's reach. After the wake, the grieving Borges goes for a drink and receives the Sahir as part of his change for a brandy. His drunkenness is another clue. For in Islamic mysticism, inebriation is related symbolically to the mystical experience, which is beyond reason and language. The coin obsesses the narrator, and he thinks of burying it in the garden. Theodelina was also buried. But Borges could be referring again to burying the infinite experience in a verbal garden, or hiding it in a corner of the library, thus hiding it in literature. And human language, as Borges knows well, cannot convey the infinite experience of divine union. To get rid of the coin, the narrator pays for another brandy with it, but the Sahir returns to haunt his memory. A book by Julius Barlach, Urkunden zur Geschichte der Sahir-Sage, gives our fictional Borges some pseudo-erudite information regarding the ominous disc. He reads that the myth of the Sahir, which he now learns means visible or manifest, dates apparently to the 18th century. But there's nothing farther from the truth, since the founder of the Dahiriyya Sahirite sect, Dawood ibn Khalaf al-Isbahani, known as Al-Sahiri, because he defended the literal sense of the Quran and prophetic tradition, lived in the 9th century. The fictitious study adds that the Islamic Sahir has had many faces or manifestations, and that obsession with it could lead to madness. In other times, it was a copper astrolabe, an infinite tiger, a prophet from Khorasan. There is always a Sahir, although it is present under different guises. With this, Borges implies that the same infinite God is viewed under different religious traditions and symbols. God is inscrutable, concludes the study. And here, Borges is again loosely translating the respectful phrase that usually closes metaphysical or religious treatises in Islam. Wa'allahu alamu, only God is wise, or only God knows, which is a phrase we also say in Spanish, solo Dios sabe. Barlach's book consoles our protagonist, for in it he learns that others have also come under the spell of the Sahir. But the book also quotes a verse from Attar's Asrarnama, Book of Things Unknown, and the quotation is, "The Sahir is the shadow of the rose and the rending of the veil." These famous Sufi symbols, which point to the mystic's experience of the material, shadow rose giving way to the infinite, transcendent rose, the infinite God, the instant his veil, kashf, is rendered. Now, Borges, the narrator, wants to see the reverse of the coin, imagining it to be like the crystal, translucent sphere of the Aleph, a symbolic mirror of mystical plenitude and of the infinite universe. Both of these small orbs, the Aleph and the Sahir, seem to be symbols of the mystic's eye of the soul, through which vision finally becomes self-vision. The symbol is of Platonic origin, and it was inherited by both Christian and Islamic mysticism. Lost in thought in Plaza Garay, Borges thinks about the mystical passages of the Asarannama and remembers that contemplative Sufis recite the 99 names of God, which Meena talked about, until the words lose their meaning, until language is annulled. Borges is describing the technique of the dhikr, by which, in a melodic mantra, Sufis recite the divine names, Allah's Malusna, to induce a contemplative state beyond language. The melodious repetition of the divine names numbs reason and thus effaces language. Anyone who could pronounce the highest of God's name, the 100th name, which remains hidden, would unveil the deity, that is, would have the mystical experience. Borges, the narrator, recitation of his own name is ironic. Sufis do not actually use their own name as a mantra. But the situation points to his personal involvement in the unveiling of the inscrutable reverse of the Sahir. I long to travel that path. Yo anhelo recorrer esa senda, he says, referring to the Sufi repetition of the verbal names to finally obliterate language, because perhaps behind the coin is God. Quizá detrás del Sahir esté Dios. We know now that the reverse side of the Sahir must be non-verbal. One must suppress language in order to access it. The transcendental experience of infinity cannot be conveyed through language. So, the Argentinian maestro effaces language while reciting the mantra of his own name. In doing so, he has arrived at the symbolic 100th name of God. He himself, as a true mystic who does not dare defile the experience of the deity with human language, knows well that the best way to convey the experience is by silencing it. Borges shows again and again his expertise in Islamic mysticism. The orthodox Sahiri or literalist Islamic school of thought, which accepted only the literal, visible interpretation of the Quran, and which was therefore attached to exterior language and theology, had its counterpart in the sect of the Batiniya, those who found under the letter of Quran a hidden esoteric meaning, according to MacDonald, 1965. Batin means precisely that, the hidden, the non-verbal, the unutterable. Any expert in Islamic mysticism knows that the terms Sahir, Batin are inseparable, the two sides of the coin of two opposite approaches to the deity, theological and exterior, mystical and interior. The esoteric teaching of the Batiniya was aimed at a spiritually select group, while the others were given the Sahir or external, less important doctrine. Borges is here dealing with a theological mystical coin. On one side, we have the Sahir of the literalists, who follow the superficial meaning of the word. That is to say, who are satisfied with physical reality and with the rational language that depicts it. On the other side, we have the Batin, the incomprehensible, infinite deity beyond language. The silent void that lies behind the symbolic coin of the Sahir is one of Borges' most successful Islamic symbols. This time, it is a non-verbal symbol, the unutterable Batin. Like Teodolina's secret name, Adela, Borges leaves the word unsaid, as a true Sufi would have done. Curiously enough, the Islamic undertones of the short story do not end here. Borges is also conversant with Islamic numismatics and seems to know that there are Islamic coins with the Sahir inscribed on one side and God on the other. This type of coin was minted by the Mameluke sultans, Al-Malik al-Sahir, the victorious, for instance, a 13th century sultan, who minted his famous public or manifest name on one side of the coin, and on the other respectfully evoked the name of God, La ilaha illallah, there is no God but Allah. Without a reasonable grasp of Islamic culture, the story of the Sahir remains inscrutable and may even seem flawed. But Borges is truly knowledgeable of Islamic culture and even more so of the mystical experience. I consider the Sahir to be his finest Islamic text. But this enigmatic short story also represents the writer's foremost mystical proposition. The transcendental experience is best conveyed by silence, not by language. Detrás del nombre está lo que no se nombra, which is a line from the poem Una brújula, from El otro, el mismo, the other, the same, by Borges, a book by Borges. Behind the name is what is not named. Behind the Sahir is the sacred abyss of the unpronounced batin. It must be left unsaid. Thank you.
Where he's from. Yeah, you were in PowerPoint. You just close this. It's mixed. Remote control.
We can maximize.
Yes, yes, sure. This whole thing, if we start this.
Or maybe can we go to the not animation, the slides and put the whole screen, the big one?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure. It's like this.
And get rid of, so we can expand it.
Yeah.
Is it possible to get this screen big?
No, that's big on the screen.
Okay.
But that's the next presentation, yeah?
Oh, this is the biggest that we have? Can we put it bigger? So the first slide is just it takes the whole screen?
On this screen or on this screen?
Here. I will do it, and then it will show on the screen. No? Okay, we can start because you can go.
We'll wait 2 minutes till the people here on site get their cup of coffee, and those of you online can do the same, and we'll start in about 1 or 2 minutes.
Yes, it is. I'm very interested. Yes, that's kind of information also.
Okay, so for the sake of keeping our schedule, we are going to resume the presentations.
Easy to listen to you. Really good. You really think by reading, you know?
Yes, I enjoyed
Yeah.
because there are many things about Borges and Argentina.
So you were really into it.
Yes,
Yeah, but it was just it's maybe even better than the book that they would, you know, because sometimes people read and it's difficult to understand, but you were so into it. You think of each sentence again.
Okay, so we are going to start with the last portion of this session. Okay, silence, please. I'll do us with the kids. Let's clap so that they keep quiet. Okay, so you have all met Cristobal because he is among the organizing team of this symposium. But now stepping back into my role of presenter, not of reader as before, I'll introduce Professor Dr. Cristobal Serran-Pagan Fuentes, who comes from the Czech Republic, from Spain originally, from Ceuta. Okay, Cristobal is professor in the Department of Philosophy at University Palacheco in Olomouc in the Czech Republic. And among other works, he's author of St. John of the Cross, his prophetic mysticism in the historical context of 16th century Spain, published in Washington, D.C. by Packen Terry's Press in 2018. So Cristobal will round off this session devoted to mysticism by talking about Thomas Merton's engagement with Muslims, insights for dialogue with Muslims today. Okay, just one brief note for people who are online and who need a Spanish translation. I won't be speaking, but I will write in the notes section in the chat of the Zoom session a sort of summary of what Cristobal will read in English. Okay, so I'll write that a synthesis in Spanish for people who are online and who don't understand the English version.
Yeah, thank you, Marcela. Muchas gracias. This is a great book for those of you who would like to know more about Merton and Sufism. It was published some years ago in Fons Vitae. The title is Merton and Sufism, the Untold Story. So we'll be quoting from this book quite a bit. Also, I brought a hard copy of my article that I was recently published, also in the volume that I mentioned earlier on mysticism and nature. This is my last research on Thomas Merton and Rosemary Ruther on the beloved creation. The title is At Home in the World. So those of you who are interested in ecology, mysticism, this is your article. It's free online. You Google it, put just the name, and you can read it. But if you want a hard copy or an email, I can send it to you by email. This is actually what you see on the picture in the slide is the information that we have of Thomas Merton in the center, in the business district center of Louisville, Kentucky, where the mystical experience happened in 1958, and the city of Louisville commemorated and honored the famous Louisville Epiphany, which some of you probably have been there, right? How many of you have ever been in Louisville and saw that sign, right? So it's a beautiful commemoration to our beloved Thomas Merton. And Thomas Merton was born in 1915. Actually, he talks about it in the Seven-Story Mountain, right? About the interesting location, because he was born in Prades, in a very small town, in a small village in France, but on the border with Spain, right? Actually, he said that just stepping down a few more streets, he probably would have been Catalan rather than French by nationality, not even a Spaniard. But he died in 1968 in Asia, in his beloved Asia. And we can talk about that later on. But remember, if you look at this picture of Prades, right, with the mountains in the Pyrenees, right, in the Pyrenees, that will be very important in terms of his spiritual geography and imagery and symbolism, because he will talk in his later books, especially the Asian Journal, about his experience of looking at the high mountains in the Himalayas, right? And that connection between where he was born, the alpha point of his life in France, right, and ending in Asia was extremely important. To the point that Pope Francis, actually in his address to the US Congress in 2015, he said, and I quote, "Thomas Merton was above all a man of prayer, a thinker who challenged the certitudes of his time and opened new horizons for souls and the church. He was also a man of dialogue, a promoter of peace between peoples and religions." And that's what I'm going to focus today on, which is what can we learn from Merton's interfaith dialogue with Islam, and not only with Islam in a very abstract way, but in a very concrete way with people who were Sufis and with people who were Muslims from different parts around the globe. So Merton as a man of dialogue, there is actually a wonderful book written by a beloved Mertonian scholar, Gregory Hillis, who unfortunately died recently of cancer. I highly recommend it. I read the books some time ago, Man of Dialogue, Thomas Merton and Catholic Vision. But what we can learn from all the major encounters, living encounters that Merton had with people from all different faiths, but especially in this context with Muslims, is that the person-to-person relationship is extremely important. And this is what this symposium is doing, right? We're supposed to here not just to read papers or read off from a PowerPoint, but we're supposed to have person-to-person encounters like we did in the previous session. And that was extremely important, and to get to know more the person, right, behind the mask. Also, it is often, and you see it in almost every single meeting that he ever had, the sense of humor always shows up, right? I mean, it's the first thing that he did with his encounters with His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama before he died in 1968, right? With Diti Suzuki in New York City and so on and so forth. He did the same thing when he met with Sufi mystics who actually visited him at the Abbey of Gethsemane. But most importantly, a warm heart, which we saw in our previous colleague today. Meena did a wonderful job, and she actually exhibited that Sufi warm heart Exactly. That warm heart is common, right? Expression of the Sufi spirit. But of course, another feature or characteristics in Merton, in his encounters with people from different faiths, is that he not only talks about doctrinal teachings or beliefs, but he brings theory and practice, right, together. And in that way, of course, as a good contemplative, he's not just talking from abstraction, but he's talking from experience, right? And that's what really matters. I mean, what is the point of talking to someone who is very knowledgeable about the moon, but has never been in the moon? I mean, I want to know from a person who has been in the moon what the moon is like, not from someone who can write wonderful theories from sociology and anthropology or whatever field, and he's talking about the moon. I mean, that's important, but the most important thing is who has been there. And please tell us more about what is your experience like of being in the moon, right? Which, by the way, some people still believe that humans have never been there. Go figure. Empathetic understanding, right? I mean, how can we approach someone who is the other, coming from a different culture, a different tradition, a different continent, if we don't have that kind of empathy, right? And curiosity and love for the other, who is, by the way, us. We are all reflections of the one absolute spirit that permeates everything in the universe. More importantly, for any sort of art of communication and dialogue, is deep listening. If we are not willing to listen, we're not going to learn anything at all. So we have to be humble, we have to be patient, we have to be restrained, and be mindful, right? Be mindful that when we encounter someone else, especially from a different tradition, we listen deeply to the other story, the other narrative, the other side. And that requires a great deal of mutual trust and respect, right? There is no friendship without trust. And that's the key to all relationships, especially in this context of interfaith dialogue. This is why I was very close to work with the bishops, with the Catholic bishops in Washington, D.C. I went through a job interview, and when I was reading and preparing for the interview, the job interview, I was reading the last encyclicals and documents, and this was under Pope John Paul II, right? And one thing I found problematic is that in those days, when we tried to open up the dialogue with Muslims and other people from other faiths, the whole question was not so much about real interfaith dialogue, but it was about how can we teach about our Catholic faith to others? And how can we impose in some way our doctrines? And how can we actually convert other people into our faith? That kind of approach, when I was reading this material, made me think more than twice whether should I be the one for that job or not, because that's not my type, my cup of tea. By the way, they asked me during the interview, and it came from a woman. It said, the question was, have you ever written or published anything about women's rights in the church? It came from the woman. Interesting. And I have never written on this topic, but I have my own opinion. And that was the end of the job interview. Anyway, I didn't get the job, even though I was the finalist. And then, of course, a spiritual friendship. I mean, this is what we are seeing here, right? In our symposium right now, we are bonding with people that sometimes we have never met in our lives, but they are close to our heart as much as our beloved friends that we have from the United States and from Turkey and from all the nations and continents. I mean, we have 4 continents in this small group here right now as we speak, and many different nationalities, thanks to our boss, Dominique, and to the center that was so generous to find the money and the resources to bring many people to this symposium. So like Merton said, love is our true destiny. We don't find the meaning of life by ourselves alone. We find it with one another. I have been teaching actually for the first time a wonderful class at Pulaski University. The title that I gave to this class was Love and the Meaning of Life, and we use Merton. So these quotes speak volumes to the hunger of the soul and the hunger of the heart to find real meaning in life. And clearly, of course, the meaning for Merton, like for many others, is love. Love is the meaning, the act of love, like Erich Fromm wrote in that beautiful book, right? The art of loving. Loving is more important than to be loved. Because if we don't have the capacity to love, then what is going to happen to our beautiful universe, right? If we don't put that active energy into motion, into action. So who are the big names in the Mertonian society, right? In the International Thomas Merton Society, who have addressed these important topics? Of course, there are big names, but the most important ones are Sidney Griffith, which, by the way, I don't know if is Sidney still alive? I don't know, because I haven't seen him in the last conferences. I see. Yeah, he was a great scholar, and he was his expertise was in early Christianity, but he was also a friend of my former professor Herbert Mason and others from Boston University, and with Sufis and Muslim scholars, and he worked from Washington, D.C. And then we have, of course, our beloved scholar Bonnie Thurston, who actually also helped and collaborated with this volume on Merton and Sufism that I just mentioned, right? This is the book. It's a wonderful volume. So Merton actually had a wonderful experience after meeting the Sufi Sidi Abdesdelam. Merton's meeting with this Sufi, Sidi Abdesdelam Talidi, who was born in 1900 and died in 1980, took place at the Abbey of Gethsemane in the fall of 1966. Dr. Bernard Phillips of the Department of Religion at Temple University arranged the meeting. They took a stroll in the countryside of the Abbey, where the Sufi master and Merton had a real conversation. Merton wrote a letter to Dr. Phillips asking him to visit Sidi Abdesdelam and other Sufis in the north of Africa, but the response was, it is extremely hard to find true spiritual Sufi masters in the north of Africa. There are very few letters exchanged between them. The only letter from Merton said, and I quote, "You ask me, is there a purpose or an object of love? It seems to me that the true love is the one God who loves in me. Love must use me to love oneself, to love all that exists, to return to the source of all love and all existence. But I love more my own will and my passions, and we come to what you call the battlefields of the nafs, of the selfish, egotistical desires in the Sufi tradition. It is that I am ignorant and stupid, and so the light of God cannot shine as it should in my nafs because I'm too opaque, too resistant, and this is the tragedy." So this is the beauty of Merton. He always shows us his true human, a side of not being there, right? And being whole. And during his lectures to the novices at the Abbey of Gethsemane, Merton, there were actually, we have now most of the cassettes, the old cassettes now converted, and they are digital, right? And you can have actually access to many of these through the collection that we have in the International Thomas Merton Society. But in one of these lectures dedicated to the Sufis that was recorded and made available at the Credence cassette, we learned that the teachings of the Sufis are found in his reading notebooks, especially number 18. How was Merton as a teacher? Merton was interested in the spiritual formation of his novices rather than in imparting knowledge of facts. Like the Sufi masters, Merton becomes a guide to develop the heart and often used laughter and informal conversations to address an important Sufi teaching via storytelling and concrete examples. He never claimed to be an expert on Sufism, but more importantly, Merton was more interested in tracing the similarities and the more common ground found within all the great mystical and religious traditions. What unites us is greater than what divides us. In addition to his taped lectures, Merton's style of teaching is apparent by reading his work in notebooks. What differentiates his lectures from his published work is the presence of Merton himself delivering his message. His love of mischievousness, even silliness, and at the same time, he never loses the critical nature of his lessons. And in this regard, I should add that the most important thing when we're doing interfaith dialogue is precisely not to focus so much on our differences, right? We have plenty. We have plenty of doctrinal differences, of biological differences in terms of identity, right? National identity and regional identity and so on and so forth. And that can sometimes separate us. It can make us blind and ignore the common things that we all share, right? No matter where you come from, we all share the same blood. We are humans. We are members of the human family. And not only we are members of the one human family, is that we are members and we are not just part, but we are the universe. And we were talking about this in our previous sessions. So the French connection, as I call it, using that old movie, as some of you remember, that means that you are getting older, right? I remember watching this as a boy and I was traumatized by the level of drugs and blood in that movie with Fernando Rey, the famous Spanish, and Jane Hackman, no? That was in that movie. But yeah, this is the real French connection, not with the movie, but with Merton through his contacts with especially Louis Massignon. Louis Massignon was one of the greatest Catholic scholars on the Sufi, right? On the Sufi teachings. And thanks to my former professor, Herbert Mason, I was introduced to these works because Dr. Herbert Mason at Boston University was actually the scholar who translated the works of Louis Massignon from French into English. And he also read and translated the works of St. John of the Cross into English and French, which is interesting. I mean, a lot of languages. This is why I chose Boston University to do my doctoral dissertation on St. John of the Cross, because I had a connection with Merton through Dr. Herbert Mason. And he was the author of many books, among them The Death of Al-Hallaj, Hallaj, a mystic and a martyr. I don't know if you are aware of this great Sufi mystic, but he actually ended up, they killed him because he said, I'm God, right? And of course, and Allah, but he's in the truth, right? But people confuse, of course, him saying, I'm the truth with, of course, when you are in an unlimited metaphysical infinite dimension and you are one with the source of life, you are the truth. But he's not the truth from a finite human perspective. But of course, some people cannot get the fun of making these metaphysical assertions, to say the least. So he became a martyr of truth. So thanks to all these great scholars, we have a wonderful literature written about Merton and Sufism. And some of the major correspondents on Islam and Sufism were Reza Araste and Abdul Aziz, right? These are two great Sufi scholars. One is Iranian, right? Reza Araste actually was a psychologist, and Abdul Aziz came from Pakistan. And you can find actually the correspondence, the entire letters in the Hidden Ground of Love. in their exchange of letters, and I'm going to cite some of their dialogues and narratives, we find that we have a beautiful letter dated November 17th, 1960, written by Merton to his Pakistani Muslim Sufi friend Abdul Aziz, that applies to the ongoing tensions and conflicts in the Middle East and elsewhere today. And I quote, "As one spiritual man to another, if I may so speak in all humility, I speak to you from my heart of our obligation to study the truth in deep prayer and meditation and bear witness to the light that comes from the all-holy God into this wall of darkness where he is not known and not even remembered. The world we live in has become an awful void, a desecrated sanctuary, reflecting outwardly the emptiness and blindness of the hearts of men who have gone crazy with their love for money and power and with pride in their technology. May your work on the Sufi mystics make his name known and remembered, and open the ears of men to the light of his truth." By the way, any amen in the house? Thank you. Merton told us this in a letter dated May 13, 1961, I quote, "But the world has turned to the abyss and away from him who is. That is why we live in dreadful times, and we must be brothers in prayer and worship, no matter what may be the doctrinal differences that separate our minds." And this is precisely what I was referring to, right? It is easy to use doctrines and separate and divorce us from who we are. But what the true mystics converge in their spiritualities and in their interfaith dialogue is the love for the other person, because they know that the other is one of us. And you cannot bring peace to the world if you don't fully understand the connection, right? That we all come from the same source, right, of life, no matter where we come from. So this is always a reminder. They are reminding us of where we come from, and we are all one, even if we don't know it. But Merton wrote to Aziz in a letter dated September 24th, 1961, that in the context of a possible nuclear warfare, it is my belief that all those in the world who have kept some vestige of unity and spirituality should unite in firm resistance to the movements of power, politicians, and the monster nations. Resist the whole movement of war and aggression. Resist the diplomatic overture of power, and develop a strong and coherent third wall that can stand on its own feet and affirm the spiritual and human values which are cynically denied by the great powers. Isn't that interesting? This is what we are seeing right now, but this was written in the 50s and 60s, in this case, early 60s. But this can apply to what's going on around the world right now as we speak. And there are nations, including my home birth nation of Spain, which in my opinion is doing a great job showing the way. And now more nations are joining the cause of resisting to these great powers and principalities, using the biblical language, that we need to resist this nonsense. I mean, how can we all call ourselves humans and be proud of being part of the human family when we allow children and women and girls and innocent civilians to be murdered and bombed and killed and tortured and raped? What's going on? What is going on? This is, I don't have even words to describe what we are witnessing every day, and I'm tired. I'm sick and tired of what's going on around the globe. And this is one reason why I'm in Europe. I didn't want to live in the US anymore, under a regime that is murdering people every day. Merton told us this in a letter dated December 26, 1962, that the departure of Louis Massignon is a great and regrettable loss. He was a man of great comprehension, and I was happy to have been numbered among his friends, for this meant entering into an almost prophetic world in which he habitually moved. By the way, prophets in this context is not someone who is foreseeing the future. A real prophet is one who bears witness to truth, justice, and love. And that's what they became, right? Modern prophets. It seems to me that the mutual comprehension between Christian and Muslim is something of a very vital importance today. And unfortunately, it is rare and uncertain, or else subjected to the vagaries of politics. I'm touched at the deep respect and understanding which so many Muslims have for him. Indeed, they understood him perhaps better than many Christians. Isn't that interesting? Louis Mansignon was really regarded and welcome, especially in North of Africa, more than Catholics and Christians at home, even in France. In a letter dated June 2nd, 1963, Merton told Assis why it is more beneficial to put more emphasis on what unites them and what it brings them together. And he said, personally, in matters where dogmatic beliefs differ, I think that controversy is of little value because it takes us away from the spiritual realities into the realm of words and ideas. In the realm of realities, we may have a great deal in common, whereas in words, there are apt to be infinite complexities and subtleties, right, which are beyond resolution. It is, however, important, I think, to try to understand the beliefs of other religions, but much more important is the sharing of the experience of divine light. I love the passages of the Quran which speak of the manifestations of the Creator in His creation, right? Or as simple as, Allah is closer to your jugular vein than you to yourself. Bingo. By the way, St. Augustine said something like that in the context of Christianity. Merton told Assis why he cannot chant the Quran in a letter dated November 7th, 1965. He said, I even gave an explanation of why I thought it would not be right for me to chant the Quran daily. I mean, remember, he's a Trappist monk, for God's sake. As I do not know how this ought to be done properly, and I would not want to simply go in from improvisation in so serious a matter. My task is rather to chant the sacred books of my own tradition, the Psalms, the prophets, etc., since I know the proper way of doing this. But on the other hand, I read the Quran with deep attention and reverence. Well, my friend, we live in troubled and sad times, and we must pray the infinite and merciful Lord to bear patiently with the sins of this world, which are very great. We must humble our hearts in silence and poverty of spirit and listen to his commands, which come from the depths of his love, and work that men's hearts may be converted to the ways of love and justice, not of blood, murder, lust, and greed. I'm afraid that the big, powerful countries are a very bad example to the rest of the world in this respect. Of course, again, he's showing empathy, right? And connecting with people who come from not only the Middle East, but from Iran, from Pakistan, and so on and so forth. So Merton responds to Assis' question about his method of prayer in a letter dated January 2nd, 1966, said, now you ask about my method of meditation. Strictly speaking, I have a very simple way of prayer. It is centered entirely on attention to the presence of God and to his will and his love. That is to say that it is centered on faith by which alone we can know the presence of God. My prayer tends very much toward what you call fana, which of course in the Sufi tradition is translated as annihilation. Actually, I wrote My paper for this class on Sufism with Dr. Herbert Mason was Fana wa Baka, a comparative study between Christianity and world religions. And we find kenosis and pleroma in the Christian tradition. We find emptiness and fullness, right, in the Zen Buddhist tradition. So this is a recurrent theme in many different world traditions, but especially in the mystical traditions. So there is in my heart this great thirst to recognize totally the nothingness of all that is not God. My prayer is then a kind of praise, rising up out of the center of nothingness and silence. Such is my ordinary way of prayer or meditation. It is not thinking about anything, but the direct seeking of the face of the invisible, which cannot be found unless we become lost in Him who is invisible, which is the ineffable, right? The absolute reality. I do not ordinarily write about such things, and I ask you therefore to be discreet about it. But I write that this as a testimony of confidence and friendship, which is what I was talking about before, right? The importance of mutual trust and respect if we're going to cultivate a strong bond with others. It will show you how much I appreciate the tradition of Sufism. In his exchange letters with Reza Rasted, who was born in Shiraz, Iran in 1927 and died in 1992, he worked with Erich Fromm and Carl Jung, but also integrated Western humanistic psychoanalysis with his passion of the Sufis, especially Rumi. Merton wrote in his journals, and I quote, "It is a great pleasure for me to have your book on Rumi. I'm reading it with great interest as I like the Sufis and admire them. In fact, it will be shortly be lecturing on Sufism to the novices and young monks here. Your book will help this. I'm interested in your book, Final Integration in the Adult Personality, which I'm sure will fill a great need in this country. The subject is important, and it is one which I will gladly preface. Do you take up the question of psychedelics?" I think this is important because it seems to me to raise the whole question of the validity of mystical experience and the real purpose of interior transformation by love. But love cannot be incited by a drug, which is interesting because now in the academics, we are seeing many people trying to do research on this topic, right, of psychedelics and using of drugs to induce an altered state of consciousness and have a mystical experience. But Merton is very clear about it, right? I mean, he said, love cannot be incited by a drug, period. Now, whether you can create the conditions, that's a different story. Merton's interest in existential psychotherapy, humanistic psychoanalysis, and logotherapy found in Reza Rasted a perfect match for his ongoing quest after final integration. In 1965, the Iranian scholar wrote a seminal work titled Final Integration in the Adult Personality, and Merton wrote an article titled Final Integration Toward a Monastic Therapy, which was published in Monastic Studies and reprinted in Contemplation in a World of Action, which is one of my favorite books. Merton wrote, "Final integration is a state of transcultural maturity far beyond mere social adjustment, which always implies partiality and compromise. The man who is fully born has an entirely inner experience of life. He is, in a certain sense, cosmic and universal man. He is, in a certain sense, identified with everybody. The finally integrated man is a peacemaker, like our boss, Dominique. And that is why there is such a desperate need for our leaders to become such men of insight." I mean, isn't that a beautiful, definition of an integral, a person who have achieved wholeness, and I also will dare to call it holiness, because to be whole is to be holy, and to be holy is to be whole. So Merton understood well the societal problems and offered solutions. Merton wrote, "The destructive and tragic solutions are not solutions at all. They simply marshal the immense resources of military, economic, and political power to block real development and to maintain established patterns in the interest of those who know best how to profit from them and at the expense of everyone else." I mean, think about these illegal wars, ongoing wars that we are seeing with no end, and how many people are profiting from it. Big corporations, the military industrial complex, the people who manufacture these weapons and they sell it. They cannot survive without it. They need wars, they need violence, they need conflicts, they need tensions. No wonder why some countries are going very hard against protesters on the streets, because they are selling weapons and they don't want their business to be out of business. They need the business of war rather than peace. Where are we to look for the true solutions then? Precisely from the Spirit, who will speak clearly at the right time through a renewed ecclesiastical and monastic community. The path to final integration for the individual and for the community lies, in any case, beyond the dictates and the programs of any culture. This is what we were talking also in our previous session, right? When Merton met His Holiness, the 14th Dalai Lama, before he died, in my opinion, he was killed, but that's a different story. He was told by His Holiness that you cannot rely on any structure, whether it's monastic or not, because the structures come and go. So to conclude, Merton once said, "If I affirm myself as a Catholic merely by denying all that is Muslim, Jewish, Protestant, Hindu, Buddhist, and so on and so forth, in the end, I will find that there is not much left for me to affirm as a Catholic." He wrote this, of course, in his famous book, Conjectures of a Guilty Bystander, which is one of the favorite books by most of us who are Mertonians. As Susanna Heschel, who is, by the way, the daughter of the famous Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, and I have the privilege to have her in one of my classes virtually, and she talked about her father. She quoted in reading Abraham Joshua Heschel today, and I quote, "What is the purpose of interreligious dialogue?" He answers his own question by saying, "It is neither to flatter, not to refute one another, but to help one another, to share insights and learning, to cooperate in academic ventures on the highest scholarly level, and, what is even more important, to search in the wilderness for well springs of devotion, for treasures of stillness, and for the power of love and care for men," which is what I believe this symposium is trying to do and convey. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Cristobal. Very shortly, I will put my Aussie hat on and give some practical information. So if you want to experience at 3 o'clock the workshop from Wilfredo Benitez, you come back here.
If you want to hear Juan Carlos Ramos Hendez and Louis Pabon Battle, I invite you to go to your own room and join Zoom, and then use it also as an opportunity to welcome and have conversation with the people who are in this conference online. So we have 13 people also online, and they will be very happy to see you also face to face. And we thought that it's the easiest is that you then yourself go to the Zoom environment in your room, and everybody has the same conditions, and you can get into conversation with each other. So there are 2 options. Either Wilfredo Benitez here, this will be not online, and then Juan Carlos and Louis Pabon will be online together with Marcela, and we have solved the technical issues. So don't be afraid of this Spanish session. We will manage, and it's also great that Marcela is willing to help us in all this translation work. So I wish you all, I invite you now to go immediately to the lunch, because our hosts are waiting for us. And then we have a longer break until 3 o'clock, and then you decide what to do. Thank you very much.